Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. My name is Sławomir Dębski. I'm director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And I'm honored and pleased to welcome all of you to the last panel, to the last plenary session of the Belvedere Forum, devoted to the future of Europe. That's a privilege to welcome and introduce to you a really great panel of experts, both practitioners and theoreticians, who'd help us to determine what exactly the future of Europe would mean and should mean, what kind of Europe and what kind of future is ahead of us. So let me introduce to you, starting from my far left, Minister Konrad Szymański, Poland's Minister for Europe, a cabinet member. Then less left-oriented, Olaf Osica, Director for Research and Development, SpotData.pl. Welcome, Olaf. Then Sir David Lidington, Minister for the Cabinet Office and former Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster, and the Minister of State for Europe at 2010-2016. Welcome, sir. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And last but not least, I would like to welcome and introduce to you Sophia Gaston, Managing Director of British Foreign Policy Group. Thank you for being with us. So let me to start our conversation, which is supposed to last 1 hour, 15 minutes. So we need to have a quick session of Q&A among members of the panels, and then I'll open the floor for your questions. Let me start from Minister Szymański. And that is a very simple question to you, Minister. What kind of Europe we should expect to have in 2030? And how we are going to achieve this vision of our preferable shape of Europe? What's your policy behind it?
I think the second part of the question is much easier than the first, because the big question of the future of Europe is really complex, and in fact we can't say too much about the future because we have a lot of questions already on the table, serious questions about the future of the continent, but also future of the European Union, which is somehow different thing. But the future of the Union is of course basic for the future of the continent, and the predictability, I think, has gone from the European politics for some years, both at the national level, but also at the EU level. It's of course very uncomfortable for politicians because we used to believe that, especially in the 1990s, early 2000, after the big enlargement, we used to believe that the integration process is semi-automatic, that the output legitimization is so strong that any negative remarks somewhere around the process, we heard that remarks, but we underestimated the nature of the negative sentiments around the European integration. We underestimated the result of the referenda in Netherlands, in France, and in Ireland. We underestimated the result of the national elections. We underestimated the nature of Brexit process. And now we are underestimating a kind of Brexit logic which is present in many countries. To be honest, the conventional truth in Brussels is that Brexit is accidental. It's a mistake, an obvious mistake, and in fact a kind of accident. It is, to my knowledge, it is not true. And what is worse for European Union is the fact that this Brexit logic is pretty present in some other countries. We hear it right now during the debate or negotiations, quite tough conflict, in fact, around the European budget. We used to also believe that our concept of development is so attractive to the rest of the world that will be duplicated, voluntarily duplicated by others, on the south and on the east. It didn't happen, as we know. Our borders are less secure than it was in 2005, 6, 7, and so on. So we have a lot of problems. And what we would like to advocate for as Poland. First of all, I wouldn't like to reduce the question of Europe only to crises. We should remember that it's still second or at least third economy of the world. It is still a regulatory superpower with an enormous potential to create a world of the future. Two examples, the data protection, industrial data flow, REACH regulation. It's a good example where the regulatory power of union, somehow soft power, but it's not so soft, and to be honest. Sometimes we feel it is really hard, is an asset. So we have at least two bigger assets, so we shouldn't reduce the question of Europe to crises only. But we should remember that without a proper answers to the question of the future of the internal market, which is not clear because protectionist tendencies, superstitions are present, not only in one or another country. They are present even in the European Commission. We have to answer for the big question of our responsibility for the outer world, for our neighborhood. It's not only a question of neighborhood policy itself, it is also the question of the enlargement policy, which is in crisis, to be honest. We know why. And of course, Poland is not responsible for that crisis, just opposite. We want to break this crisis. We want to show the way out of this crisis. And the third aspect is, of course, the very present question of the future of the European budget. Because this discussion is not only about money, this discussion is also about the readiness to contribute to this project. And this readiness is fundamentally limited in countries which would like to present themselves as most pro-European. Sometimes they are trying to judge ourselves in terms of European conscience. It is really big paradox, I would say. So without the proper, fundamental, clear answers about the future of the market, future of our foreign, let's say, maybe not policy, but foreign influence, how we want to interact with the outer world, and without the proper answer for the question on budget, we can't show the way how to see the European Union 2030 as a healthy, efficient, effective, and in the end, attractive institution, to avoid the situation where we will face another exit in 10 years. All questions are on the table, and we have to be very careful with the future predilections.
Thank you very much. This initial intervention leads me to Sir David. We've heard about 3-4 things which would determine the future of Europe, future of European Union. You were responsible for British policy towards the European Union for a while. Are you still interested in these developments within the European Union? Of course, you are not anymore involved in the budget negotiations. That's a good thing. But probably the less a good thing is that you are not so much involved in discussions about the foreign and defense policy of the EU. So how this debate within the Europe may shape British response to the question about the future of the continent?
Oh, I think look, starting point is that geography, history, geostrategic interest, economic interest mean that the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union is going to remain of prime importance to political leaders in both jurisdictions. I mean, a lot of this conference has been spent talking about the economic relationship. I think that if you look at the geopolitics, I mean, us leaving means that we haven't now been able to put a brake on some of the moves I think may risk blurring the lines between EU and NATO responsibilities, I think would be an error. But leave that to one side. You look at can you talk about a European, with a capital E, security, defence and foreign policy position, unless the UK is involved in some way, when you've got one of the only two countries in Europe that has actually got significant forces and have the political will to deploy them if needs be. And you're talking about a country that is permanent member of the UN Security Council, G7, G20, NATO. Our departure means that the High Representative has lost, I think it's roughly a fifth of her military capability and a quarter of her diplomatic capability, aid, etc., etc. Now, I do not believe, having been a strong Remain supporter of the referendum, I do not believe that the UK can or should seek now to rejoin under Article 49. I think to do that from scratch is going down a cul-de-sac. Loss of budget rebate, obligation to take up the euro. So and it's going to be too early, too raw to think about that. Now, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years' time, my two prior questions are, right, what will the UK look like and what will Europe look like at that stage? And while I'm a very strong unionist and believe that the union could and should hold together, the UK union could and should hold together, I think it is in peril at the moment, and how the Johnson government handles these negotiations will have an impact on the debates in both Northern Ireland and Scotland about the future of the UK. So that's one set of issues needing to be settled. The other is what's going to happen with Europe. I agree with a lot of Konrad's analysis. As I look at it, so if you're like a friendly outsider, if the Eurozone wants to survive and prosper, then it's going to have to integrate fiscal and economic policies more closely to fit with a common currency and common interest rate and monetary policy. If you're going to do that, that is going to require some sort of political institution to hold such decisions accountable. And so if France and Germany, perhaps under a different German government in the future, decide to bridge their differences and move in that direction with a compromise, what then happens to those full EU member states who are not members of the currency union? Because you then start to see divergence within the category of EU full membership. And I do find myself very intrigued by Macron's talk about circles, because it seems to me that the language coming out of the Elysée about circles is not very different philosophically from some of the thinking that has been happening in the UK for many years about variable geometry, about a more flexible Europe. And if one went forward from the immediate difficulties and you thought of a Europe in 15 years' time where you could accommodate that divergence between tightly integrated Eurozone members, full members of the EU who are not in the currency, where then does the UK, Norway, Switzerland, Iceland dock into such a structure of European cooperation? Does that then provide you with the framework for the Western Balkans, given that France seems to have given up on enlargement? Does that provide you with a new way of thinking about the relationship with Ukraine and the other Eastern Partnership countries? So I think that is the sort of thinking that will take us forward. And my last point is this. One of the unlooked for consequences of the 2016 referendum in this country has been the emergence for the first time ever of a very strong, vocal, predominantly young, pro-European voice in UK politics. That's never existed before. Those people are likely to, given the demographic, to grow as a proportion of the electorate, and therefore it would be a mistake to think that UK public opinion is simply going to turn its back on Europe and lose interest in Europe for the future.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Your last point leads me to Susan, because in your research, you try to determine these factors which, the changes in the society, which influence the foreign policy and elite, because foreign policy usually has been perceived as an elitish thing, not for common people. some kind of the mystery should be, around it. So, what would be your response? What we should expect? What kind of changes we should expect within the societies, which may have an impact on how Europe would look like in 10 years' time?
So I think it's great that we're talking about the domestic within this international context, because as you say, that's something that hasn't often been as big, as prominent in the conversation. And I think if we really look at all of these broader forces of destabilization and dysfunction in the liberal world order, a lot of that is reflecting domestic social and political constraints. So I think it's really important for the foreign policy community to have a better understanding about the social dynamics in play as well. And it is also true that public opinion about foreign policy is becoming more politicized. Now, what I mean by that is that, as you said, foreign policy was something that citizens were happy to actually sort of defer to their leaders. Salience and knowledge and interest and engagement was much lower than other policy areas. I conduct social research, public opinion research into a range of issues, but also foreign policy and views on kind of global issues of importance. And what we're starting to see is that people are becoming more interested in foreign affairs, global issues. They feel they have a stake in them now as well, and that they are becoming fused along these broader axes of polarization that we're seeing in society. So this huge sorting effect. And you can see that here in Britain, these views about the world, our role within it, what we care about, how much we care about things like climate change, how our attitudes towards immigration, multilateralism, membership of NATO, et cetera, et cetera. We're starting to see this very clear sorting and quite a distinct gap growing between these different segments of the population, to the extent where it is difficult to actually conjure a sense of consensus around not only issues of importance, but also who our allies and our foes are, for example. And these have been actually incredibly important tools of governance domestically for political leaders. If you think about the Cold War and so on, this idea of this common enemy actually served an incredibly important domestic social function. So I think that if we're thinking about multilateral governance, multinational governance, and of course the EU is a sort of microcosm of these challenges that the West is facing more broadly, you also have to think about the challenges of governance within those nations. And I think we are living in a time of a great democratic experiment, because we've never before tried to conjure liberal democracies that are so diverse, and I mean that across a very wide spectrum of levels, but also so empowered. And this does present opportunities, but also deep, deep challenges, and we are sort of muddling our way through. I've just done a big study of public opinion in Europe across 13 member states, and some very consistent themes came up. And these are the sort of battlegrounds that the EU and its institutions are really going to have to get their heads around, thinking about the role that they can play in, I think, facilitating governance in member states, and also the role in which they can play to kind of bring that all together and be a force in the global world to champion and respond to some of these issues. And just to quickly run through those, I mean, in a very rudimentary level, you've got this kind of division between this nostalgic sentiments, nostalgic narratives, and more future-oriented visions. You've got intergenerational conflicts. The conflicts between generations are some of the most acute around these very sensitive issues, immigration, national identity, culture, values, etc. There's also gender-based conflict. In the survey, you can see very distinct public opinion between men and women on quite a lot of different issues. And then, of course, you've got this sort of support for the established principles of democratic governance, representative democracy, and those who are sort of clamoring for a more kind of direct, populist style of democracy. And what's really important to note when you're looking across the EU as a whole is even when you see common trends, the manifestations of those and the causes and the factors that have led to them are very distinct. Of course, these nations all have incredibly distinct historical and political contexts. But I should note as well that there is a very clear distinction between what's going on in Central and Eastern Europe and what's going on in Western Europe, and that in many cases the trends are just in complete reversal. So in Central and Eastern Europe, it's actually the older generations who are more likely to defend what we might call liberal democratic values, and actually the young who are calling for kind of more disruptive and even sort of more, I suppose, illiberal, less progressive stances on a lot of social issues. So pulling all of this together is a very difficult challenge, but I think that the first step is for the EU and its institutions to get a better understanding, a better handle of what's going on domestically in each of its member states.
Thank you very much. So now we have European Union perspective, British perspective, the perspective of changes which are occurring within the societies in Europe. So we need yet another one. I mean, there is a lot of discussions around the world about a new era of big powers rivalry, in which Europe would not play the role it used to play. I mean, a kind of a center of power, which can influence the outside world, but would rather be a victim of this rivalry. So that leads me to Olaf Osica, who writes about these issues extensively in Poland. So how this rivalry may shape the future of Europe in the 2030 horizon?
Thank you, Sławek. Thank you for having me here. Well, let me start on a positive note. I guess in Europe 2030 is still going to be one of the best places to live in the world. I think this, I believe, will not change. Also, London and Warsaw will be one of the best cities just to live in Europe. But then, just to answer your questions, I guess there are three main issues, of course, and when you talk to Europe 2030, we may come up with a number of issues, so I take it as a sort of intellectual exercise or provocation. The first thing is that it's going to be Europe without the UK, which means that Europe will be much more continental. By continental, I don't mean geography, I mean mindset, I mean a socio-economic model, and I mean growing, or I would say not only growing, but the key role of Germany. I mean, it may sound strange because we already have a problem whether we have to what extent do we still have a European Germany or German Europe. I mean, there are different people in different angles, different cities answering these questions differently. But I believe that this is one. If I were to find one of the major strategic effects of the Brexit is the role of Germany and France, of course, in shaping this new continental Europe. Second thing is, of course, you mentioned us, US. I'd say that Europe will be strategically more alone. By which I mean that, well, the US will be a close political economic partner, but less of a strategic ally. And this is the fact when we follow the American debate, 2013, and so it might be, it won't be Trump, but it won't be someone else. But I mean, whoever takes the White House in the end of this decade will have a different sense of what is the U.S. leadership, what is the American responsibility, and part of the problem is that Europe will be, some would say, well, in some capitals, less dependent on the United States. From our point of view, we would say that we will not have this sort of American presence in Europe that we would like to have. And the third thing is China. I guess Europe will be still confronted with a more and more political and economic pressure of China, plus migration from the South, from Africa, and from the Middle East. Yeah? So when you put those three things together, and as I said at the beginning, we may have another variables, but if you follow those three variables and then you try to juxtapose them with what it means for Poland, I would say, again, it means three things. I mean, first of all, with or without Brexit, it doesn't matter. I mean, Poland is facing a strategic challenge, actually, to adapt to new times. Yes? I mean, there is a lot of, for those who follow to some extent a Polish debate. There is a lot of self-complacency in Poland because of the economic success, because of the political success of the last 15 years, EU membership, NATO membership. But I guess this self-complacency is one of the problems which we are having in Poland. And this is what will not only will have to change, but this will change because of those issues I mentioned before. And it takes, when I mean, you know, that Poland will have to adapt to new situation, again, I mean three things. I mean, politically, it's a question of, you know, what is the place in European politics? Some people say that, well, because the UK is leaving, so in relative terms, you know, the Poland's position just, you know, goes up. I think it's a false idea. I mean, of course, in relative terms, when you look at the numbers, it might be true, but in absolute terms, politically, Poland will have to fight strongly, actually, just to secure its place. And then the question which is, seems to me will be pressing, although we avoid this kind of discussions, of course, the question of euro, and you mentioned that to some extent. But thinking of euro not only in economic terms, but actually just, you know, what kind of, you know, euro and the political standing of Poland in the United Europe, you know, provided that euro is still, that eurozone, you know, persists till the end of the next decade. The second thing is the economic dimension. I mean, the Polish economic model based on relative, you know, well-educated, cheap labor force is exhausting. Everyone knows that. So the question is, you know, what comes next? And I think this is the moment when we are actually entering the period realizing that, first of all, the labor force is not as cheap as it used to be, I mean, no longer. And secondly, that, well, the education is also not as good as it used to be. To give you an example, I mean, we're talking about, well, like the, you know, future of European economy. It will be, to a huge extent, a digital part of it. And there is the European Commission, DG Connect, publishes every year the so-called Digital Economy and Society Index. And when you look at the numbers, Poland is at the far, far end of the scale. Yes, actually. So when it comes to digital skills, Industry 4.0, all sort of issues which are pressing and which are present in the UK debate, I mean, there is a lot of we have to catch up just to be ready simply not only to secure our growth, but actually just not to lose our jobs to other countries like perhaps Ukraine or some other countries. Yes? And the third issue is, of course, security. I guess one of the, I haven't mentioned Russia, and I did it deliberately because I believe one of the key problems which Poland is facing is to switch its foreign and security policy discourse towards security of the citizens from the defense of the state against Russian aggression. And this is something which is, I mean, it takes time, but when you look at all those issues we are discussing, like these days, like coronavirus, you know, digital issues, you know, migration, you see that actually, although we have in our minds, you know, the Russia as the key threat, I guess the Russian threat is going to lose in importance and significance for Poland, which will be good because this is the only way actually that we remain somehow interoperable with the key of the mainstream political European discourse. So to close up, I mean, the question is, of course, what does it mean for the UK-Polish relationship, because we are the Belvedere Forum here in London. I'd say it's very much on the, I mean, the ball is in the British court. I'd say it's very much on the British side. If the relationship between EU or between the UK and EU is going to be, as I guess was Prime Minister Johnson said, a Canada-style relationship, then it's going to be a Canada-style relationship. I mean, we like Canadians, they're a member of NATO, but they're far, far away, not only in terms of the distance, but also, you know, mentally, economically, and politically. If, on the other hand, you know, the UK decides actually to strike a good deal for both sides and remain as close as ally of the European Union as possible, then I guess there is some window of opportunity that this is not the last time that we're meeting here in this place. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much. And after these initial interventions, I would like to open the floor for your questions. And in the end, I would like also to come back to the members of the panels and give them the chance to have a last word. Perhaps you know, take some of issues raised by other members of the panels. So the floor is open. Robin, prepare your questions. Be as brief as possible.
I'll be quick, because I saw people were hesitating maybe after lunch and digesting all the good comments. A question for our Polish interlocutors, especially the minister. Brexit, or Britain leaving the EU, has opened up the prospects of a form of European integration that may have more concentric shape to it, levels of integration that may spill across from EU membership to, in some cases, countries that are non-EU members or applicant members, or some maybe even that were former members. Poland may or may not join the euro at some point. It may therefore be in a different space within the European Union. Turkey in the future, who knows? Ukraine in the future, who knows? I suppose to our Polish interlocutors, I'm just wondering, as we're talking about the future of Europe and the future of the EU and the future of Europe, do you, if you're looking forward 5, 10 years ahead, do you see the EU progressing down one track, or do you see it perhaps over time having a slightly more flexible approach to integration that may provide docking stations for countries like the UK once we're past this very difficult stage of negotiation? And obviously to our British counterparts, if they want to take this on, do you share any of those views or think they might be practical or attractive?
I will take 2 more questions if there are.
Thank you. My name's Vernon Bogdan. I'm from King's College, London. I mean, is the central task of the European Union integration or ever closer union, or isn't it the task for which it was set up, namely to secure peace in Europe, originally to integrate a revived Germany within Europe? Now, Germany is no longer the main threat to European peace. The main threat comes from the Western Balkans. So isn't the main task of the European Union now not to secure further integration, which is arousing nationalist feelings in many European countries, including some at the centre of the project, but to create a roof over the hostile nationalities in the Western Balkans, such as the old Austrian Empire tried to do, failed to do, and create a European perspective in that part of the world. And from that point of view, shouldn't every effort be made to reverse President Macron's decision not to allow the countries of the Western Balkans into the European Union? It seems to me a powder keg.
I would add my own brief question, exactly going in the line of the last question that was posed. I mean, how should we think about the idea of enlarging European integration? Should it be a part of our plan for Europe in next 30 years? What we should do to keep this project as inclusive as possible, because that was the strongest European magnet for years, that there are those living on our close proximity wanting to become one of us, members of the same club.
I think looking at the map of Europe, it's pretty clear that the Western Balkans is a missing aspect of the European integration. It's pretty clear and historically proven that we need enlargement in this part of Europe. So the enlargement crisis is a very strong illustration of crisis itself. Because if we can't even open the debate, even open the process, which is absolutely controllable, it is not a process which would be automatically, which would lead us automatically to the very end one day, and we would have no say about the outcome. It is, of course, not true. If we can't even open the negotiations, it means that our political readiness, our political effectiveness is very, very limited. And we should be very serious about this case. I hope we will fix it during the nearest European Council, but it doesn't mean that we fixed the real problem. And the real problem is the fact that in many countries, which used to believe that they are the conscience of the European integration, the legitimization, the social support for the European integration is shrinking. And this is an important fact. We see it in the budgetary debate. It's not about the frugality, it's about lack of mandate in the parliament. We see it in an enlargement process, we see it in the neighborhood process, in the Ukraine association agreement crisis, everywhere. This is the same group of countries. And I don't want to blame any of those prime ministers because I believe they are truly pro-European. But what is happening at the back door in the parliaments is something real and serious. So I think the European Union without Great Britain will be not in a position to do whatever we want with our own future. I think 3/4 of Brussels believe that EU without Britain will be easy piece of cake, because now we are free, we can do the most ambitious plans for federalization. And of course, Paris is a capital #1, using this phrase that now we are, in the end, free to do what we really dream of for decades. It is, of course, not true. I think United Kingdom hasn't been a country blocking the Eurozone integration. Poland isn't a country blocking at the moment the Eurozone integration. We don't want to interfere with this internal discussion. It is someone else, by the way, the same group of countries, who are definitely blocking any form of fiscal or economic integration of the Eurozone. I would agree, from the academic point of view, it is true that it's hard to imagine the efficient Eurozone in the nearest years without a deeper integration. It would be logical to have a deeper fiscal integration, but the readiness to open the door for any transfers, and it comes with transfers, is zero. And it's not about Poland, it's not about UK, it is internal contradiction of the Eurozone, which is present whatever will happen with the rest of the Union.
The same question to Sir David. How you feel about it?
I mean, I've always supported variable geometry, and I think if if circles leads us in that direction, I think that's healthy for European cooperation per se. I mean, leave aside the UK question, although I think it would point the way towards a resolution of the divorce, but not for another generation. I think that's what we have to look at. There's got to be a lot of development both on the UK side and the EU side before we can seriously and constructively have that sort of conversation. If I look at the Western Balkans, I think, I'll be completely honest, I think the way that North Macedonia was treated was outrageous. I think Zaev took existential political risks in his own country, did everything that had been demanded of him, and then had this crushing sort of slap in the face. Albania, I think you can make arguments sort of slightly more nuanced. I think Rama's done a lot, but there's obviously huge problems to come. But Konrad made the point. I mean, you need unanimity at each and every stage. To open a chapter, to close a chapter, needs unanimity in the council. So the council had and would still have control over each stage of the process, and could, as it has done in the past, insert new additional steps, pre-access or pre-chapter arrangements if the council feels it needs that kind of assurance. But if I try to put myself in Emmanuel Macron's shoes, what he's looking at is a very fragile political situation in France still. That with the potential exception of the race in Paris at the moment, the political alternative to Macron and La République En Marche is still Le Pen. Neither the Parti Socialiste nor the Républicains are showing a serious sign of political recovery. And what are the two things that are feeding support for Le Pen and support for comparable political movements and for radical movements to the left as well as to the right in Europe? It is fear about the economic impact of digitization and global competition on the one hand, that is upending all our assumptions about what constitutes a safe career in the future, including white-collar and professional work. This isn't just factories. Coupled with fear of it's both migration and the challenges of integrating large numbers of people from other parts of the world. And that's certainly, both those issues are potent in the French debate, but those are potent elsewhere. And if the political leaders of the EU have any sense of really wanting the EU as a project to survive, but it applies nationally, UK and member states as well, it's showing that traditional representative democratic institutions and a liberal democracy can provide effective answers to those challenges. Because if people look at our system and think, this isn't working for me, they're going to look somewhere else. And I remember again and again in our referendum campaign, I was knocking on doors for Remain. And I could deploy all the economic statistics that I wanted to about benefits of the single market. And you'd often get the reply back, well, that may be your economy, but that doesn't seem to be working for me at the moment. And it's answering that question that is the existential challenge I think every government in Europe faces.
Susan?
So, I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable to approach this question of enlargement as a potential pathway to differentiated membership, and it seems that would be a rational path for the EU to go down. But I think there's a number of challenges. I mean, one of the biggest challenges at the moment is around upholding values within the system once people are already members. And this question around differentiated membership can't really be approached until you work out what that actually means for this values question. And if values in and out of scope, you know, how do we conceive of these differentiated tiers or circles or whatever we want to call them of membership? It seems to me that the Article 7 process has been a failure. And I think that is a huge political failure for the EU, and it is a huge question around its legitimacy to citizens as well, because I've done quite a lot of polling and surveys and so on Article 7, and actually citizens do support those kinds of sanctions and measures and want action to be taken. Now, how that translates through the process of their nationally representative democracies and then that, you know, channeling up to the Council and to the EU is another thing, how those views are mediated. But I think the EU really needs to get to grips with what it's actually going to do with this and how that would apply to a differentiated membership model. I would say around identity, a survey that I've just done recently across the EU, I mean, you can see that European identity is something that has taken hold across the vast majority of member states, although it is secondary to national identity. National identity remains people's foremost identity, but it's also being held in conjunction with European identity. And I think we often frame the political debate, and certainly many of the discussions in Brussels had positioning these as somehow in competition. And the idea that patriotism or national identity is somehow existentially damaging for an EU or European level identity. And I think we need to move beyond that, because people will not relinquish those national identities. They will remain powerful. But what we should be doing is helping people to understand how they can be held together.
Olaf?
Just very briefly, I guess it goes without saying that, you know, EU needs move on, and I guess there was no appetite for, you know, integration understood like, you know, building institutions or going deeper. I think in this sense, there is no federal sentiment across Europe, never been in France, and it's not even in Germany these days. But so my conclusion would be that because of the external pressures, we talk about China and the US, I mean, the enlargement is a good, strategically smart move. And I guess it's going to happen. I mean, the Western Balkans is an obvious case. I wouldn't exclude Ukraine, 10, 15 years as well. But the only question is, or the problem is, that we need to try to redefine, you know, what a membership really is. Because we stick to the notion of membership and a concept definition of the membership, which is like, you know, back from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, or even just, you know, the 90s. But with this concept of membership, we won't be able just to move on. Yes, because it's about budget, because it's about common institutions. But when you look at the EU now, I mean, the UK is leaving, yes, but you got Romania and Bulgaria, which are full members of the EU, but they are, you know, they're not part of the Eurozone, they're not part of Schengen. As you see that you have the Norway, you know, Switzerland, Icelandic model, yes. So if you define the membership through policies, like for instance in Ukraine, I guess the Ukraine is a problem that if the European Commission wants to build the fifth pillar of the single market, which is the free flow of data, which we need for the, you know, Industry 4.0 and so on and so forth, then the question is, why don't we actually look at Ukraine actually as a member of the single market understood that way. Yes, because if we don't make this move, we will have, well, Americans, that would be not a big deal, but Chinese companies actually just being in Ukraine. So I guess we have to move on from the basic in terms of what do we mean by the membership, full membership, what is the concept, and by that I guess we can provide in the coming years a new opening. And I guess there is appetite for success. In the end of the day, I mean, that was the story of the 90s. I mean, just, Poland and other countries, we joined EU, not because there was, enthusiasm all over the place to accept us, but because there was a need, yes? I mean, there was a failure. I mean, there was a Maastricht Treaty, there was a war on the Balkans, yes? There was the external oppression, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the threat of Americans withdrawing. And, and out of it, just, the concept of why don't we start to, well, see how, far, how deep we can go. So I think, in this regard, I'm quite optimistic that it's going to be more of an enlargement discussion than a, constitutional kind of treaty debate.
Thank you very much. Now we'll have time for 3 more questions. Hans, please.
Hans Kundunani from Chatham House. I want to ask about the future of freedom of movement, and in a way this follows from Robin's question. Freedom of movement was obviously one of the factors that drove Brexit. Cameron tried to renegotiate it, didn't really get very far, and then we decided to leave. This isn't really a concern that has been shared that much in the rest of the EU, to some extent in countries like France, in particular about Polish immigrants, in fact. But not really to the same extent as in the UK. It looked like the UK is quite exceptional in this respect. And on the other hand, Poland has always been a very strong supporter of freedom of movement. And in fact, this was one of the tensions in the UK-Polish relationship for a long time. But what seems to be happening at the same time is now increasing unease in the countries in Central and Eastern Europe and in Southeastern Europe that are sending people, i.e. countries like Poland, about essentially an exodus of people. Unease about freedom of movement rather than because people are coming, but because people are going. Ivan Krastev in particular has written about this. So I suppose my question is really, I guess, for Olaf and for Minister Szymański, I suppose 2 things. Given that Brexit has now happened, is the freedom of movement issue resolved, or will this unease continue? In particular, will there be increasing unease in Poland? And in 2030, will there be complete freedom of movement within the EU, or will it have been restricted?
Thank you very much. If there is no question from the room, I would offer my own now. I would like to, I would be very much interested how the West should coordinate its policy in this 10 years time perspective, particularly given the fact that the European Union was a platform for harmonization of responses to such challenges like Russia's undermining international law, aggression, and I mean particularly here the sanctions instrument. What kind of vision we should have to coordinate our policies of the countries on the continent, still integrating in themselves within the European Union, and there is no problem of shaping common stance, and the United Kingdom, which would be outside of this framework, but still, for many, many reasons, a very important country for shaping a free world policy to financial flows, markets, and global economy. So how we should think about this coordination in the future with United Kingdom being outside of the EU?
We should think about it as ambitious as possible, because we can protect our values, our interests in the world, in this changing and challenging world, only with the unity of the West. Unity of the West is, of course, based on EU as well, but the EU is not the only aspect. We need also NATO cooperation. We need widest possible umbrella, which would project the power of the West by unity of the West. So losing UK from EU architecture means that we risk a rebalancing of the EU situation, and it is a serious risk from Polish perspective because transatlantic, let's say, sensitivity and understanding what is the importance of the transatlantic ties is a very important asset and contribution of the UK to the EU. So this a losing balance in the EU means that maybe some decisions will be taken more easy, but it means also that we more easy would make mistakes because the efficiency of the decision-making system, just the technical efficiency, isn't the only criteria. Also the essence, what is the product in the end, is equally important. So we will advocate what we advocate since the beginning, the unity of the West, whatever form will be needed. Of course, we have a lot of trust for more institutional form. We hear from London that institutional form of foreign and security policy isn't needed because in the end the will is most important. I would agree, of course, in the end the will, even those most institutionalized form of cooperation anyway, and in time of crisis leads to the coalitions of willing. It's true about Europe, so we can continue on base of will. But for some aspects, we need a new form of cooperation, a little bit more than just ad hoc cooperation. I mean a sanction policy. And both London and Warsaw use the sanction policy instruments quite actively, and I think with a good reason. We are today 2 years after the Salisbury attack, so I think it's timely to say that there are good reasons to be very vigilant on sanction instruments we have. So we have to find a way how to do it, having Britain outside. On free movement, I think it's a big question because it is a matter of fact that we agreed, we all, 27, we agreed with David Cameron that we will offer some instruments, emergency break for Britain to suspend free movement for 7 years, as some other countries did just after the accession. So it was a postponed transitional period for UK. It means that there's very strong fundamental approach to free movement of people as a fundamental aspect of the treaty freedoms. We agreed that we can talk about it, but we wouldn't like to go too far with this relativization of the importance of the free movement of people. I agree that we lost a lot of people, and this is not, in the short term, it is not a good fact for our economy and for our society, but it is somehow a principal question. We wouldn't like to affect the people's freedoms and people's choice to realize their life expectations, their life projections this way. So we can't agree for any form of discrimination on the internal market. In France, we are not talking about Polish migrants. We are talking about Polish workers, a workforce, contributing to the national income more, statistically, much more than French citizens, because they are much more active. The same in UK. They are much more active in terms of labor activization, tax paying, all kind of contribution paying than the average. So we are not talking about just migrants. We are talking about the labor force adjustments and labor market flexibility, which is needed for Europe. In the end, it's good for Europe. We understand the political stake that time, that maybe with some form of a limitation of this unwelcomed freedom in UK, we would make a better result with the referendum. It's a good argument, of course, but I believe that in some cases we have to confront misleading perceptions. And one misleading perception is the reduction of membership benefits only to contributions to the budget. It is a fake news, because the benefits coming from the single market are much more than any contribution of any net payer around the table. And now I'm not talking about UK anymore. And the second thing is, of course, the value and the role of the free movement of people. It is a fundamental dimension of the single market, and we should be serious about the social fake perception about the real role of this freedom for the market.
Susan? My name's Sophia, sorry. I think on freedom of movement, I mean, I think in the short term, the conversation is really going to be focused on securing external borders. And we can see the tremendous shift in thinking in this approach just this week to the situation in Greece. So I think that's going to be the shorter term. I mean, I was doing focus groups in Ukraine last year, and the one thing that they really were focused on, talking about what their huge aspirations were for Ukraine and its future, you know, sort of within the context of a potentially becoming an EU member, but also just more broadly, was freedom of movement. You know, they want to be free. And talking about the Soviet Union as a time when they couldn't move freely, they couldn't, you know. So I think it's going to be politically difficult to kind of roll back from freedom of movement because it's been so critical to the EU's kind of framing of its sort of structural purpose. And just on the West, I mean, I think if you look at the big issues that are facing the West, so many of them necessitate cooperation. I think I am hopeful that Britain will be wanting to be an active, engaged participant in all of this. And I actually think that we are incredibly well placed to be playing quite an instrumental role in triangulating between you know, Europe wanting to be a world global power on various things, a much more volatile and unpredictable United States. There are some issues as well that Britain, I suppose, with the space and oxygen of not being in the EU, could potentially be leading on even more strongly as you know, in its sovereign state now after Brexit. So I think that we will be playing a leading role, particularly in defense of liberal democracy, climate change, and so on. And I think this is where COP26 will be incredibly important for Johnson to show that he can put the meat on the bones of that global Britain vision.
Thank you very much. So, David?
I agree very much on COP and on the climate change issue more generally. I think on movement, I mean, what was pretty much unique about the British situation is that in the eyes of the public, free movement by EU citizens was lumped into a wider concern about migration of large numbers of people, whereas I think in other member states, people drew a distinction between those two things. And I do think that migratory pressures will be a massive political challenge for Europe in the decades ahead. The population of sub-Saharan Africa is expected to double in the next 20 to 30 years. That's another 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, the idea that these pressures are simply going to go away by, you know, another deal with whoever is ruling Turkey is for the birds. You know, this takes into very difficult territory about, you know, a 1951 UN convention, and is that fit for the modern world? But you know, you need another seminar just on that, Robin. I think. But to go to your question about how should the West coordinate policy. Well, we have to use the institutions that remain: G7, NATO. And so on, meetings in the margins of UN General Assembly and the like. But I do worry that the fact that British and ministers and ministers from other European countries and their officials will not be meeting week by week in the margins of Council in Brussels is simply going to mean that conversations take place and decisions are reached without taking account and understanding of the other's point of view and the other's interests. And that means that it's more difficult to get mutual trust and confidence, and it's more difficult to build a coherent policy that serves everybody's shared interests. So I'll be quite frank, I was disappointed that the Johnson government has, for the time being at least, rejected an institutional cooperation on international policy with the EU. I said I can understand the politics behind that, but I hope that that's something that perhaps once this next phase of negotiations is behind us, they will look at afresh, because it seems to me that it's in the UK's interests to be having those regular structured conversations, not just in an EU context, but bilaterally with individual EU member states as well, to understand each other's positions, and then from London, we bring a lot to the table and we can influence a shared outcome rather than having the EU come to a formal position in the FAC, which is painstakingly agreed, needs unanimity. Then the UK is told, well, take it or leave it. This is our agreed position. And the UK government turns around and says, oh, well, we won't consult it over that. Yeah, do your own thing. We'll do our own thing. There'll be a few degrees different. That's a silly way to handle international relations. Olaf.
Last intervention.
Yeah, I mean, to answer Hans' questions, well, at first, I do believe there's going to be a free movement of people. I mean, especially for EU citizens. I don't think if there is no major collapse of Central European economies, then actually, you know, the Poles traveling to Germany will be as normal as, you know, Spaniards traveling to France or, you know, Germans to the Netherlands. I think this is happening. I mean, when you look at the Polish-German border, there's a number of people living on the German side because it's cheaper, there's better housing, working on the Polish side, yes? And this is something what we observe. What we may have, and here the digital comes and artificial intelligence, we may have a Schengen with some digital borders if the migration pressure goes. Yes, I can think that, you know, you may have some elements of borders, you know, for those, I mean, for instance, you know, if Germany accepts a number of migrants, they have to stay in Germany, yes. If they want to leave, they have to go through, legally leave, yes, they have to go through certain borders, yes. So I guess there is a lot of with artificial intelligence, although we are very critical about the Chinese experiment, and I agree. Well, I'm afraid we're gonna use a lot of this in trying, if the migration pressure is still so high. For non-EU citizens, yeah, exactly. Yes, because that's the problem. I think the problem of EU citizens, just, you know, traveling is not an issue if there's no major collapse of Central Eastern economies. But the migrants, it is. And on the question of services, what Mr. Szymański mentioned, well, you know, there are, I mean, as always, you know, there are two sides. On one hand, I mean, people are very critical about like the postal directive and all sort of issues, and it's true. But the flip side of the coin is that, you know, there is a number of Polish companies that need the pressure actually to start compete with the quality, not with the price. And I think in this sense, I mean, from the Polish point of view and the point of view of Polish economy, which need to develop, this sort of, you know, pressure, you know, French, German, I mean, it's good. Of course, there are going to be some victims, no doubt about it. But, you know, this is the only way actually just you improve, you know, I mean, and this is how actually we Polish economy, I work now in business, so I really, you know, I sense it, yes. If there is no pressure actually, external pressure, you know, the companies are not, especially the small and medium-sized companies, they try actually, if the price is fine, so why should it be changed, yes? But the other thing is, of course, that, you know, like with the French, yes, I'm finishing. If the French government wants, you know, a Polish butcher to pay French social insurance rather than a Polish one, it's not a problem, because in the end of the day, it's the French consumer that's going to pay a higher price for a steak, yes? So it depends, I mean, which companies you're talking to, but I guess despite all the problems, I think it's a normal process of actually, you know, countries like Poland just being, you know, developing and facing challenges which, you know, in the past that was the Portuguese, you know, Spanish experience. So I'm quite optimistic about it.
Thank you very much.
Just short reaction. Because of course it is pretty obvious that we don't want to compete with prices. It is old story, not relevant anymore. All sectors active in internal market are playing and are competitive with quality. What we are opposing strongly, we just went to the court with this posting of workers directive, and mobility package will be the same, is artificial protective clauses, which doesn't create any better standards in terms of social and labor protection. This is just the cutting the market into pieces. And the services market isn't completed anyway. And when we see the tendency to move back, it is a threat because the services is the most important potential for economic growth across the EU. And this is simply unfair.
Thank you very much. This was a fascinating panel about the future of Europe. And actually, we managed to talk about this unpredictable future in the way which inform us what kind of the factors may influence this future and how we should think about also the social dimension in it. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to all of you to join me in rising in applause and thanking our members of the Parliament for attending this.